Hello lovelies. Today we're taking a look at the Usagi Yojimbo role-playing game. Now this is the 1997/1998, opinions differ, Fuzion version of the RPG by Greg Stolze. A very different company called Sanguine put out an Iron Claw first edition powered system around 2006 or so that was about twice as big as this slim volume page-wise, capping out around 200 pages. There was also a second edition of the Iron Claw version of the game that wasn't really another edition. Apparently that's a contentious topic. That was a square format hardback that was put together through a Kickstarter in 2019 or so. But this is the older version based on Fuzion. So the whole game is based on the comics that started in 1984 or so and are still fairly regularly going with collected editions, still coming out on the regular. The character of Usagi Yojimbo you may have seen, more likely to have seen in other media. He's crossed over with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on a fairly regular basis. And even sort of had his own animated series in 2018, which was put together by Netflix. Now, for reasons best known to themselves, the Netflix series was not really Usagi Yojimbo, it was set in the future. There were occasional flashbacks done in more traditional animation instead of CGI. Those were really good. That's what the series should have been, but it wasn't. So yeah, you'll be a bit disappointed if you go and look at those, unless you skip through most of the episodes to find the more traditional, old school animation that actually depicts Usagi as we know him. Now, you may have noticed at some point, as I've begun moving through this book, that Usagi is a rabbit. And Usagi is, yes, definitely, your eagle eyes are not deceiving you. Usagi, well, that's the Japanese word for rabbit, as I recall, and he is indeed an anthropomorphic animal. Usagi, in the sort of timeline of furriness, he kind of exists as an anthropomorphic animal in a nebulous space between anthro and furry in the timeline. His first appearance was in Albedo, not the sci-fi furry RPG, but Albedo Anthropomorphics, which was a Fantagraphics publication, sometimes credited with creating or boosting the adult furry subculture. But Usagi very much seems to be in the older anthro sort of genre. It's at that kind of break point. It is an adult comic, but adult in this instance refers to the somber tone, mature themes, and the seriousness that goes into it, rather than anything adult in it in the XXX sort of sense. The books are set in a fantasy version of Edo period Japan and follow Usagi on his warrior pilgrimage as a lone wanderer going from place to place, walking the earth, doing assorted deeds and interacting with various interesting characters, many of whom are drawn from history, mythology or pop culture around Japan, such as Zatoichi, Lone Wolf and Cub, Gojira, all kinds of other stuff. And of course crossing over with TMNT and other things as well. But enough background. It is a samurai RPG where people are animals. Animals are usually lizard-looking dinosaur things, and insects are often pretty sinister monsters. Magic and stuff exists, but mostly in the background. Your characters aren't really going to directly interact with that in any way. It's just there for supernatural creatures and various supernatural shenanigans to go on. Now, this book isn't even quite 100 pages. I don't think people would be happy with it today. It's 96 pages. It was published in 1997 by Gold Rush Games using the Fuzion system. Fuzion is sort of the successor to Interlock, which most people today won't remember either of these systems, which presents something of a problem in explaining. So Interlock was a game system that had various different iterations. It powered the original Cyberpunk and then an updated version of it. Powered Cyberpunk 2020. And so the Fuzion system kind of combines elements of Interlock with elements of the Hero system that powered things like Champions. So if you're interested in game design system lineages and taxonomy, and why wouldn't you be, this Fuzion then went on to influence the Action! System by Gold Rush Games, which is an open system, and also all of these things went on to influence my own Splatpunk system, which is meant to be compatible with Interlock Heritage Games. Now, Interlock had an early stranglehold on the Japanese/anime RPG segment because it was the system that kind of pioneered that shit through games like Mechton and Teenagers from Outer Space. So Mike Pondsmith is a fucking weeb. It's the lesson you can take from all this. So yeah, R. Talzorian, Interlock, and then later Fuzion. Complicated. Like a lot of older games, and older licensed games in particular, this booklet assumes that you already know your shit. That is to say that you know Usagi Yojimbo and his world pretty well. You've read some of the comics, that you have an interest in historical Japan. This isn't an assumption that many tie-in properties make today. You will often find them to be fairly exhaustive lore books as well, maybe as a sort of added value thing. So there's not a huge amount of background material in here, but the assumption was that you wouldn't need it. There are quite a few comic pages, which is nice, and the artwork is drawn from the comics, which is nice too. But I think to modern eyes, this book would seem very unsatisfying. Now, I haven't read the Iron Claw version, so I don't know how much deeper that goes into it, but at double the size, you've got to imagine that some of that time wasn't spent on system and adventures, and some of it was spent on background. So if that's more your interest, that might be more your option. But I think the rules here are probably better than those in Iron Claw, Jade Claw, even the newer editions. The version of Fuzion it uses in here is called Instant Fusion, which is a sort of Fate accelerated as compared to Fate. That's the kind of relationship Instant Fusion has to Fuzion, but not quite. Interestingly, there is a conversion page in the back for converting from Fuzion to Fudge. Fudge being the ancestral system that led to Fate. So presumably with a little bit of work, you could play this game using Fate if you wanted to. Again, system taxonomy, that's fun. I guess it's kind of game wonk, game designer interest that isn't really going to be interesting to anybody else. Hey ho. When you're rolling to do stuff, you are rolling 3d6, adding your stat and skill and getting a result versus an opponent or a target number. So it uses 3d6 instead of a d10, which was more usual for Interlock and Interlock derived systems. And Cyberpunk and Interlock tended to follow a 5-point linear step difficulty, so it would go 10, 15, 20, 25. Here the difficulties start higher, so a 10 in Interlock is a 14 difficulty in this version of Fuzion, because the average roll is higher and so on, and steps up in 4s rather than 5s, because you get a nice bell curve with 3d6. If you score a critical, which is 666, then you'll roll 2 additional dice and add them on. If you roll a critical failure, 111, both those rolls are quite unlikely. You roll a single d6 and take it away from the result. So that's how that works. So it's all pretty simple, pretty easy to follow. If you hit in combat, you do damage dice, d6s, equal to your body, modified, limited, or altered by the weapon you're using. That's taken away from health. If you hit 0 health, you're out. If you get hit again, you're dead. Enemies that you take to 0, you can choose to disable or kill. Subdual damage, non-lethal damage. If you get reduced to 0 hits by that, you're just knocked out, and it'll take another blow to kill you. So all fairly simple, fairly easy for you to grok and understand. Combat is fairly swift and fairly deadly as a result. Starting character stats run roughly from 1 to 7, no more than 8. Skills run maybe half that if you focus and specialize. So most of the time you're going to be rolling maybe 3d6 plus 8 if you're particularly skilled and you have average-ish stats. Your character's species matters. Like if you're a bat, you get the capability to fly, you get supersonic sonar radar to help you, Batfink, but you also suffer -3 to perception rolls during the day, and so it goes for the various species. So that's obviously impolitic, but I guess they kind of dodge around that by having it be the whole anthro thing. And certainly characters in the comic book, while the species that they are tells you something about their character, it usually doesn't tell you everything about their character. So you can't necessarily assume that a character who is a snake is duplicitous and traitorous. It's still probably a good bet, but there are characters that defy all of these kind of expectations. They do have a set of characters from the comics, all listed and statted out. They're all fairly sanely leveled in terms of power, which is nice to see. Even Usagi only has a combat stat of 6 and Kenjutsu of 5, so he's not necessarily even especially optimized for being a samurai, despite being a very effective one in the comics. So that's quite good, I think. Lead by example, give a proper sort of scale to measure characters against. There are some more in-depth combat rules that go over and above the kind of quick fusion rules. More advanced than the basic understanding of the systems. They let you choose combat stances or strategies. For example, provide information on how to engage with multiple enemies, detail the weapons a bit more, and even get into some fairly complex jiu-jitsu rules. So if you're into men rolling around on the ground in a homoerotic embrace, you can do that. You do you, boo. But grappling rolls always suck. That's a constant. That is a rule when it comes to RPGs. Wrestling rules suck. But they are there if you want them. There's decent GM and player advice in the limited space that we have, but it does somehow manage to waste some of its scant few pages on sample adventures, which I can't see as being a worthwhile thing. The character sheet makes the game look a lot more complex than it actually is, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And yeah, we get a few comic pages, which is nice. But this game is... look, they're crowing about the fact they have a website, because this was 97, and the internet was only just really getting into the swing of being generally popular. That's when it all went wrong, when it stopped being nerds and techie people on it. Yeah, so this is a product of its time and the design philosophy of the time, though it's interesting to see Fuzion as an early example of a licensed game system, prior to the OGL, but with a lot more control over it. So it never really hugely took off, but it's interesting to see licensed properties using compatible systems across different games. So it's interesting to see that. And for me, as a game designer, that's my main interest in this game, is that kind of taxonomy of game systems and where this fits in that sort of lineage of Interlock, Hero, Fudge, Fate, Cyberpunk, Mechton, Teenagers from Outer Space, all the rest of it. That's the huge interest for me. I do like the Usagi comic, not enough to collect it, but I do like it. Also, these days you have the weight and pressure of expectation around furriness that is very unfortunate. But this is closer in tone to, I would say, Grandville or Grandville by Brian Talbot, who did that as a kind of throwback to the Anthro comics. But this is, as I say, this is very much a product of its time. It is very thin. It is flimsy. It's using a licensed system. It's using a lot of comic art, which, you know, saves money. The layout is fairly clear but primitive, I guess, to a modern eye. It's black and white, whereas everyone seems to expect colour these days, the bastards. And it's just, there's not a huge amount here. It's not the kind of lore book that we've come to expect from tie-ins. If you compare this to modern tie-in RPGs, it's very different. It's very scant, because back then people assumed that if you were a fan of whatever, then, and you were buying the RPG, then you didn't need everything spelled out for you, because, well, you were already a fan and you already knew stuff. So the only real major piece of interesting lore in here is probably the character stats and character list and the timeline, though of course this is going to be out of date now because it's continued to be published. System wise, I think Fuzion is probably better than even the modern iteration of the Ironclaw Jadeclaw system. There you can go and check my reviews of those, the earlier editions and the more modern editions, if you want to know more about that here on this channel. Scores then, I mean, this is a retrospective, so the scores aren't really particularly relevant. I don't know if you can still get this. I didn't do my research on that. Probably turns up secondhand fairly often, I would have thought. In terms of style, it's very basic, but it is using the original comic book art for the most part, and that is effective, and it's what you would want. And a lot of it was originally published in black and white, so that's perfectly fitting. Otherwise, it's very basic, very workmanlike, too modernised, too basic and too workmanlike, but it's not fair to judge it in modern terms. Still, I think even for the late 90s, I mean, you know, we had Vampire and other things upping the visual game at the time. So a very low 4, I think, for style, and that's primarily because of the comic book artwork that you see throughout the book. In terms of substance, there really isn't a lot here. Even back then, if I'd bought this back then, rather than getting it from a friend who was downsizing his collection, I think I'd have been upset. I probably wouldn't have bought this if I saw it in the store, just because it's so slender and doesn't have enough material in it for me to run with it and do Usagi justice. So in terms of substance, mid 2, I guess. So that's a low 4 and a mid 2. That's 6 out of 10. That is 3 out of 5. That's average, but that's average for the time, I think. These days, I would probably drop it another point. So that would be 2 out of 5 or 4 to 5 out of 10. Less than average score. So the main interest I think that anyone would probably have in this would be, well, completionists, Usagi fanatics and collectors, and people who are interested in the kind of weird back roads of RPG system licensing, how different systems came together, moved apart, when Fudge started sort of entering the main public consciousness, all of those things. This is a time capsule, a mosquito in amber of a very particular period in game design, and for me, that's the main interest. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.
I don't wanna